Imagine waking up on a damp Tuesday morning in April 1933, stepping out onto your front porch and reaching down to pick up the morning paper. The smell of ink and wet paper hits your nose, but as your eyes scan the front page, the blood completely drains from your face. Prominently displayed across the top is an urgent decree issued directly from the White House. The President of the United States has just declared that every gold coin, every piece of gold bullion, and every gold certificate hidden under your mattress, locked in your floorboards, or resting in your safe deposit box is now illegal for you to own. You are given exactly 25 days to hand over your life savings to the nearest Federal Reserve Bank. If you choose to hold on to even a single ounce of your family's hard-earned wealth, federal law enforcement will come for you. The punishment for keeping what belongs to you is up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary and a $10,000 fine, an amount so crippling at the time that it would utterly wipe out every asset you, your children, and your grandchildren might ever hope to possess. This sounds like a scene pulled straight out of a dark dystopian thriller, but it was not fiction. This was the absolute reality for millions of everyday Americans on April 5th, 1933, when Executive Order 6102 was quietly signed into law. To truly grasp how a nation founded on the sacred principles of personal liberty and private property rights pulled off the single largest wealth confiscation in modern history, you have to mentally step back into the freezing, desolate winter of 1932. America was not just struggling, it was completely broken. The Great Depression had been tearing through towns, farming communities, and bustling industrial cities like an invisible fire for nearly 4 straight years. 1 out of every 4 American workers had no job, no income, and no safety net. Bread lines stretched for miles down frozen streets in New York, Chicago, and Detroit. Desperate mothers boiled leather scraps with water just to give their starving children the warm illusion of soup. Farmers stood on their dried-out, cracked land with loaded shotguns, desperately trying to fight off local sheriffs who had arrived to seize their livestock and homes. The American public was not merely poor, they were gripped by a deep, suffocating terror. And when human beings reach that level of primal fear, they stop placing their faith in promises, institutions, and government paper. They look for something tangible. They search for something that has survived the fall of empires, the destruction of monarchies, plagues, and wars for thousands of years. They look for gold. In those days, the financial system did not run on invisible digital digits on a computer screen, nor did it rely on green paper backed by nothing more than government assurances. The United States operated on a strict, unyielding gold standard. Every paper dollar circulating through the hands of shopkeepers, factory workers, and coal miners was legally anchored to actual physical gold sitting securely inside government and bank vaults. A paper bill was not money in and of itself. It was literally a warehouse receipt. You could walk straight up to a bank teller, slide a paper bill across the polished wooden counter, and the teller was legally bound to hand you a heavy, shining gold coin in exchange. Gold was the ultimate anchor of truth in the economy. It kept politicians honest because it put a physical limit on their power. The government could not simply turn on a printing press and manufacture billions of dollars out of thin air to pay for bloated projects or cover up massive debts. If the government wanted to spend $1, it actually had to possess the real, physical metal to back it up. As bank after bank began collapsing like a row of dominoes across the country in early 1933, that fragile paper trust snapped completely. A frantic stampede broke out. Millions of terrified citizens lined up outside their local banks in the biting cold, pounding on the glass doors, demanding to exchange every piece of paper money they owned for real gold coins. They had watched their neighbors lose everything overnight when local banks locked their doors and declared bankruptcy. They wanted something they could physically hold in their hands, something that could not evaporate into thin air if a financial institution went under. Inside the quiet, mahogany-paneled offices of the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury, panic of a completely different nature was taking hold. Millions of ounces of gold were draining out of the national financial architecture every single week. Foreign nations, equally spooked by the crumbling American economy, were shipping millions of paper dollars back to Washington and demanding that physical American gold be shipped across the ocean to their vaults. The nation's gold reserves were evaporating at a terrifying speed. The political elites realized they were trapped in a massive lie of their own making. Over the years, the system had quietly issued far more paper claims than there was actual gold resting in the vaults. If every American citizen and every foreign creditor showed up at the same time to redeem their paper for physical metal, the United States government would be forced to admit a devastating truth. The country was bankrupt. The vault floors were bare, and the entire monetary system was running on pure bluff. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, stepping into a storm that threatened to tear the nation apart. But the solution his administration crafted was not to restore public faith through honest accounting or fiscal restraint. Instead, they decided to rewrite the fundamental rules of human property ownership overnight. Under the guise of a national emergency, Roosevelt executed Executive Order 6102. The language was carefully crafted, draped in patriotic duty, and presented as a necessary sacrifice to save the nation from greedy hoarders. The political narrative was spun with calculated precision. Anyone holding on to gold was framed as a financial traitor, an unpatriotic sabotage agent who was single-handedly dragging the economy deeper into the abyss by refusing to let their wealth circulate. The order was absolute. Every single individual, family, small business, and institutional trust was commanded to surrender all physical gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1st, 1933. In exchange for surrendering their ultimate security, the government offered to pay them $20.67 for every paper equivalent ounce handed over. Consider the psychological trap that was sprung on the average working citizen. You had spent 20, 30, or 40 years waking up before dawn, sweating in steel mills, breaking your back on farms, or working in small grocery stores. You had carefully saved real gold coins because you believed in the stability of your country and wanted to shield your family from ruin. Then, with a single stroke of a pen, the leader of your country told you that holding on to your family's life raft made you a criminal liable to be thrown into a cell alongside murderers and thieves. Safety deposit boxes in banks across the nation were immediately frozen by federal directive. Bank officials were ordered to stand guard over the vaults. If a citizen wanted to open their own private deposit box, a bank employee had to stand directly beside them, watching their every move to ensure no gold coins were surreptitiously slipped into a coat pocket. Neighbors began looking at neighbors with quiet suspicion, wondering who among them was secretly keeping gold hidden beneath their floorboards, buried inside glass jars in their backyards, or sealed inside the plaster of their cellar walls. Fear is a powerful force, and for millions, it worked exactly as intended. Tens of thousands of obedient citizens lined up at bank counters, holding small tin boxes, velvet pouches, and worn leather bags filled with gold coins that had been passed down through generations. They handed over real, tangible wealth that could never be destroyed by political decree, and in return, they received stacks of crisp paper bills that no longer carried any promise of gold redemption. Why did the federal government go to such extreme lengths to strip physical gold from the hands of its own citizens? It was not simply to stop bank runs. It was the masterfully timed setup for one of the most ruthless financial bait-and-switch maneuvers in human history. Once the administration was confident that the vast majority of physical gold had been successfully pulled out of private hands and locked tightly inside federal vaults, they pulled the trap door. In January 1934, less than a year after forcing Americans to hand over their gold at $20.67 per ounce, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. With another stroke of his pen, he officially raised the price of gold to $35 per ounce. The sheer audacity of this move is astounding. The government forced you, under threat of 10 years in prison, to sell them your physical gold at $20 an ounce. Then, once they had your gold locked safely behind their vault doors, they instantly declared that same gold to be worth $35 an ounce. Overnight, the federal balance sheet gained billions of dollars in value out of nowhere, while every American citizen who had obeyed the law lost over 40% of their purchasing power in a single moment. It was a silent, legal confiscation of human labor and generational wealth. No army marched down Main Street to seize property at gunpoint. The takeover was executed with official stationery, emergency declarations, and psychological manipulation. The government used the honest wealth of its own people to bail out its own failing monetary architecture, covering up decades of institutional mismanagement by stripping the population of their financial defense mechanism. For the next 40 years, generations of Americans grew up in a world where holding a real gold coin was a federal crime. An entire culture was systematically reconditioned to believe that paper bills were real money, while the physical metal that had anchored human freedom for millennia remained locked away in dark, heavily guarded vaults, strictly forbidden to the very people whose labor had created the nation. Once the gold was locked inside federal vaults, and citizens were left holding paper bills that were rapidly losing purchasing power, the American financial landscape changed forever. The psychological shift was subtle at first, but it reshaped the relationship between the individual and the state in ways that would reverberate across decades. For the first time in American history, the wealth of ordinary people was no longer insulated from the political ambitions and spending habits of Washington. Without the physical anchor of gold in public hands, the government held a monopoly over the value of money itself. To understand how deep this trap went, you have to look at what happened immediately after the 1934 devaluation. When the official price of gold was raised from $20.67 to $35 an ounce, the Federal Reserve instantly booked an artificial profit of roughly $2.8 billion. In today's terms, that was a staggering windfall created literally out of thin air. But that profit didn't go to the farmers, coal miners, or factory workers who had surrendered their family heirlooms under threat of prison. It was absorbed directly into government coffers to fund massive federal expansion projects and bankroll unprecedented state interventions. Meanwhile, the everyday citizen was forced to adapt to a reality where saving paper currency meant watching their life's work slowly erode. Throughout the late 1930s and into the 1940s, as World War II broke out across Europe and Asia, the federal government capitalized on the centralized gold control it had established. Because private ownership of gold was illegal inside the country, the government could print billions of dollars in paper bonds and fiat currency to finance the massive war effort without worrying about citizens rushing to bank windows to exchange their paper for physical metal. The ultimate check on government spending had been completely neutralized. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly during these decades to ensure the American public forgot why gold mattered in the first place. Media outlets, newsreels, and public educational campaigns framed gold ownership as an archaic relic of a primitive past. Citizens were told that modern, sophisticated nations ran on trust, national pride, and government-managed paper credit. Anyone who questioned this new order or expressed a desire to hold tangible assets was subtly labeled a conspiracy theorist, an economic illiterate, or worse, an unpatriotic obstructionist. However, beneath the polished surface of economic modernization lay a sinister mechanism of control. By outlawing private gold, the government had quietly stripped citizens of their financial exit door. In a free market where individuals can freely buy, hold, and trade gold, the price of gold acts as an immediate alarm system against government mismanagement. If an administration prints too much money, inflates the currency, or runs reckless budget deficits, citizens buy physical gold to protect themselves. As gold prices rise, it alerts the entire nation that paper money is losing value, forcing politicians to rein in their spending. By banning gold, Roosevelt and his central planners effectively smashed the alarm clock. They could now inflate the money supply, debase the currency, and fund government programs without any immediate physical warning signs showing up in the hands of ordinary voters. The general public, stripped of their metallic shield, had no choice but to keep their savings in commercial banks, where interest rates were controlled and inflation silently siphoned off their purchasing power year after year. This dynamic reached a critical turning point as the world entered the mid-20th century. At the end of World War II, world leaders gathered at a remote resort in New Hampshire for the historic Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. The goal was to build a new global financial architecture out of the ashes of war. Because the United States held the vast majority of the world's physical gold, much of it gathered during the 1933 confiscation and supplemented by wartime trade, the U.S. dollar was crowned the undisputed reserve currency of the planet. Under the Bretton Woods system, a clever new global illusion was constructed. Foreign central banks were told they didn't need to hold physical gold themselves. They could simply hold U.S. dollars, and Washington promised that any foreign government could swap 35 paper dollars for 1 ounce of gold at any time. But there was a massive catch that the general public rarely understood. This promise applied only to foreign governments and foreign central banks. The average American citizen living in Ohio, Texas, or California was still strictly forbidden from owning a single gold coin. For nearly 2 decades, this system appeared to function smoothly on the surface. America experienced a post-war economic boom, suburban neighborhoods expanded, and consumer culture blossomed. But behind closed doors in Washington, the old habits of government spending came roaring back with a vengeance. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the U.S. government found itself bogged down in expensive foreign conflicts like the Vietnam War, while simultaneously launching massive domestic social welfare programs known as the Great Society. To pay for both war abroad and expansion at home without raising taxes to politically suicidal levels, Washington did what central powers always do when unmoored from sound money. They turned on the metaphorical printing presses. Billions of new paper dollars were flooded into the global financial network. It didn't take long for sharp foreign leaders to notice the discrepancy. French President Charles de Gaulle was among the first to call Washington's bluff in the late 1960s. De Gaulle realized that the United States was printing far more paper dollars than could possibly be backed by the physical gold sitting inside Fort Knox. France began loading ships with stacks of paper U.S. dollars, sailing them across the Atlantic, and demanding that the American government hand over actual physical gold bars in return, as promised under the Bretton Woods Treaty. Other nations quickly followed suit. Gold began flowing out of Fort Knox at an alarming speed, echoing the terrifying bank runs of 1933 on a global geopolitical scale. The U.S. gold reserve was shrinking rapidly, dropping from over 20,000 metric tons down to a fraction of that amount. The United States was facing international bankruptcy because it had issued trillions in paper promises that its gold vaults could no longer fulfill. By August 1971, the situation had reached a boiling point. President Richard Nixon retreated to the presidential retreat at Camp David with his top economic advisors for a secret weekend conference. The atmosphere was tense, desperate, and filled with panic. They knew that if foreign nations kept turning in paper dollars for gold, the United States vault would be emptied completely within months, destroying American global dominance. On Sunday night, August 15th, 1971, Nixon preempted popular television programming to address the nation. In a calm, measured tone, he announced what economists now call the Nixon Shock. Nixon stated that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign governments. He blamed international speculators for destabilizing the currency and framed the decision as a defensive measure to protect American jobs and domestic stability. In reality, the temporary closure of the gold window was a permanent default. The United States had officially cut the very last thread linking the paper dollar to any physical reality. From that exact Sunday night forward, every dollar bill in circulation became pure fiat currency, a piece of paper whose value exists solely because a government decree says it has value, backed by nothing more than the military power and taxing authority of the state. The fallout was immediate and devastating for the average family. Freed from the last remaining physical constraint of gold, the floodgates of currency creation were opened wide. The 1970s saw a brutal wave of stagflation tear through the American economy. Prices at grocery stores, gas stations, and housing markets skyrocketed while wages stalled. People watched their hard-earned savings evaporate as the purchasing power of the fiat dollar plummeted. Yet, throughout this entire economic catastrophe, the average American citizen remained completely helpless to protect themselves using traditional means. It had been nearly 40 years since FDR's 1933 ban on private gold, and 2 full generations of Americans had grown up completely disconnected from sound money. Most people didn't even realize that holding physical gold was once their fundamental right, let alone how to use it to shelter their families from the raging inflation storm of the 1970s. The stage was set for a massive legal fight. A growing movement of constitutional lawyers, libertarian thinkers, and economic historians began pointing out the profound hypocrisy of the system. The government had cut the dollar completely free from gold, yet it was still prosecuting and threatening citizens who wanted to buy physical gold to protect their wealth from government-created inflation. The pressure began building on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers were confronted with uncomfortable questions about why a free nation continued to enforce an emergency executive order passed during the Great Depression, an order that effectively treated law-abiding citizens like common criminals simply for desiring financial sovereignty. The artificial illusion constructed in 1933 was finally beginning to fracture under the weight of its own internal contradictions. By the early 1970s, the economic pressure valve was on the verge of exploding. The Nixon Shock had shattered the illusion that paper dollars were backed by tangible wealth, and the ensuing wave of stagflation left millions of Americans searching for answers. For over 40 years, the American public had been forced to trust that central planners in Washington knew best. But as prices soared at the grocery store and savings accounts lost value month after month, people began looking backward to figure out where the financial rails had truly been pulled up. All roads led straight back to April 5, 1933, and Executive Order 6102. The legal and political fight to restore private gold ownership in America wasn't led by elite Wall Street bankers or government officials. It was pushed by a grassroots alliance of constitutional scholars, independent economists, and ordinary citizens who realized they had been stripped of their financial self-defense. They began asking uncomfortable questions on Capitol Hill. Why was an American citizen legally allowed to buy foreign currencies, real estate, fine art, or speculative stocks, but faced 10 years in federal prison for owning a piece of physical gold? What emergency justified keeping a Great Depression law on the books when the Depression had ended decades ago? Leading the political charge was a conservative Republican congressman from Idaho named Philip Crane, alongside a growing coalition of lawmakers who argued that banning gold was a dire CT violation of fundamental property rights. They pointed out the absurd reality of the mid-1970s. The federal government had completely severed the dollar from gold, claiming gold was a useless, barbarous relic, yet it strictly prohibited its own citizens from possessing it. If gold was truly irrelevant to the modern economy, why was the state so terrified of letting everyday people hold it? The public pressure became impossible for Washington to ignore. On August 14, 1974, President Gerald Ford signed a historic piece of legislation that officially repealed the prohibition on private gold ownership, effective December 31, 1974. For the first time in more than 4 decades, law-abiding American citizens could walk into a shop, buy a gold coin or bullion bar, and legally hold physical wealth in their own hands without the fear of federal marshals knocking down their doors. On January 1st, 1975, as the news spread across the country, millions expected a massive, chaotic rush on gold markets. Financial commentators predicted lines around the block at bullion dealers, but what actually happened was far more subtle and far more revealing about the long-term psychological impact of state control. There were no massive riots or widespread panics. Decades of steady public school education, media messaging, and government propaganda had done their job with terrifying precision. 2 full generations had grown up knowing only paper money, credit cards, and bank ledgers. To the average American in 1975, gold felt like an ancient curiosity rather than the foundational bedrock of human trade. The government didn't need to enforce the ban anymore because the culture itself had been successfully re-engineered. The physical gold had been removed from the public's hands, and the memory of why gold mattered had been systematically erased from their minds. This subtle psychological victory set the stage for the modern financial system we inhabit today. With gold completely removed from daily commerce and private ownership, rendered a niche hobby rather than a standard savings mechanism, the guardrails were entirely gone. The modern era of unchecked fiat expansion had begun in earnest. To comprehend the sheer scale of what unfolded after the gold anchor was removed, look at the national debt and the purchasing power of the dollar over the last 50 years. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the United States national debt stood at roughly $400 billion. Today, that number has ballooned into the tens of trillions, a figure so vast that human comprehension struggles to visualize it. When money is backed by gold, government spending is strictly limited by how much gold exists in the vault. When money is backed by nothing more than government decrees, spending is limited only by how fast the electronic ledgers can be updated. This constant creation of new currency isn't just an abstract macroeconomic statistic. It acts as a hidden, silent tax on every single person who works for a living. When the central bank creates trillions of new digital dollars out of thin air to finance federal deficits, fund wars, or bail out failing financial institutions, the total pool of dollars expands, but the amount of actual goods, services, houses, and food in the economy doesn't automatically double overnight. As a direct result, every existing dollar in your bank account loses a fraction of its purchasing power. You see this play out every day, even if you don't realize the root cause. It's why a single income could buy a home, support a family, and pay for college in the mid-20th century, whereas today dual-income households struggle to pay rent and keep up with basic living expenses. It isn't simply that things are becoming more expensive, it's that the currency used to measure their value is continuously being diluted. The purchasing power of the US dollar has plummeted by more than 85% since gold was unhooked from the currency in 1971, and over 98% since FDR's original decree in 1933. When you trace this chain of events from 1933 to the present day, the grand architecture of the financial system becomes clear. The 1933 gold confiscation was never just a temporary response to a banking crisis. It was the crucial first domino in a decades-long transition from sound money to complete fiat control. By confiscating the gold, devaluing the dollar, locking the gold behind foreign-only convertibility at Bretton Woods, and finally severing the link entirely in 1971, the state achieved what monarchs and emperors throughout history could only dream of: absolute control over the creation and valuation of wealth. In the modern digital age, this dynamic has evolved into its ultimate form. We have transitioned from paper bills to digital numbers on a screen. Today, central banks around the world are actively developing central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, programmable digital money that could give governments direct, real-time oversight over every transaction made by every citizen. If an executive order in 1933 could force citizens to hand over physical gold under threat of prison, imagine the leverage a central authority holds when your money exists entirely as bytes on a centralized government server that can be frozen or restricted with the click of a button. This is why understanding the story of Executive Order 6102 is so vital for anyone navigating the modern financial landscape. It serves as a stark historical reminder that true financial security cannot be built on the promises of institutions that hold the power to change the rules of the game whenever it suits them. Gold was target number one in 1933, precisely because it was outside the control of the state. It couldn't be printed by a political committee, it couldn't be devalued by a press release, and it didn't rely on a third party's permission to hold value. As the global financial architecture faces new pressures, unprecedented national debts, persistent inflation, and geopolitical shifts away from paper reserve currencies, the old lessons of 1933 are resurfacing with undeniable urgency. Individuals, institutions, and even foreign central banks are once again quietly accumulating physical gold and alternative, decentralized assets at record rates. They are searching for the same thing everyday Americans were seeking almost a century ago: a store of value that stands outside the immediate reach of central planners. History doesn't always repeat itself word for word, but its economic rhythm remains remarkably constant. When governments face unpayable debts, they don't default openly. They dilute the money supply. They change the definitions, they pass new emergency regulations, and they encourage the public to look anywhere else for the cause of their declining purchasing power. The events of April 1933 proved how quickly the foundational rules of an entire society can be rewritten under the guise of an emergency. In a single morning, millions of citizens went from law-abiding savers to potential felons simply for holding the same money humanity had trusted for thousands of years. The gold may have returned to private hands decades later in 1974, but the power structure that took its place never left. As we move deeper into an era of digital financial monitoring and endless debt expansion, the ultimate question hanging over every individual remains the same one that faced Americans standing in bank lines in 1933. Is your wealth truly yours if someone else holds the master key to its value?